Yo, can you hear me? Yes? Yo, I'm sweated out. I'm like losing water weight by the minute. So my name is Jorge McCraw. I'm the founder and executive director of Dig Deep, and I'm going to start with a little story. 4 years ago, I had my dream job, and I'll show you a picture of it if I can. There we go. I was in Cameroon building a water system for 20,000 people. And it was our first project of this size for Dig Deep, which was still a small startup nonprofit. At the time, more than 70% of water projects in the developing world were failing in the first year. And we thought we could do better by putting communities in charge of their own projects. And it worked. We started with a single well in South Sudan, and within a couple years, we had grown into a multinational organization. We were doing big projects like this one. And I felt really happy and fulfilled, like I was doing something that was really helping people, changing their lives. And then this woman named Karen Reynolds called me. You know how sometimes in the movies, like there's this young punk kid with an attitude, but probably some untapped potential, and they stumble in somewhere at night and they meet an older, wiser person who is just going to completely change the trajectory of their life. And they start training together or whatever, and at first it's all like wax on, wax off, and then all of a sudden they're fighting an army of black belt teenagers with a sensei named John in a parking lot full of burning tires, and you're like, how did we get here? I really love the Karate Kid a lot. Let's call that the Mr. Miyagi method of enlightenment. My Mr. Miyagi was named Karen Reynolds. She's a 50-year-old donor of ours from Ventura, California, and she called our office one day to make a donation. And she said, I want to make a donation, but I want you to spend it here in our country bringing people clean water. I was like, Karen, sweet Karen, why don't you let me use the money where it's really needed in a place like Cameroon where people don't have water? And she said, George, you dumbass. And she convinced me to get in my car and drive 10 hours with her from my house. I had never even met her. I don't know why I just said yes to this. From my house in Los Angeles to rural New Mexico so she could show me exactly where she wanted me to spend her $50. Karen Reynolds knew something that I didn't, which is that nearly 2 million Americans still don't have access to a safe source of clean running water in their home. Most Americans don't know that. These are our neighbors, some of whom don't have water that's clean enough to drink, some of whom don't have basic plumbing, some of whom have no access to water at all, and I knew nothing about it. I was that guy you write sort of scathing blog posts about on Medium. Like white guy, does a degree in international law, has an idea he thinks will save people's lives, and immediately flies to Africa. I hadn't even bothered to look in my own backyard, and if I had, I would have met Americans whose experience is really different from our own, who struggle every day just to get enough clean water to survive. I might also have met people like this. This is Darlene Arvizo. She's Navajo. She is a grandmother of 3, and in her little town in New Mexico, she's known as the Water Lady. On the Navajo Nation, nearly 40% of people still don't have a tap or a toilet in their house. And so Darlene's a school bus driver who wanted to do something about this. So every day after her bus route, she drops off the school bus, picks up a water truck, and delivers as much drinking water to her neighbors as she can get before she goes back to run the afternoon route of the school bus. Darlene's clients get by on about a gallon of water a day. You or I use about 100. And that struggle to get water from her, and when they can't get it from her, to get it from an open pond or a livestock trough that's contaminated, or driving really far to pay for bottled water, that struggle impacts their health, it eats up all their cash, and it causes a tremendous amount of stress. But why? Why in 2017, in the largest native reservation in the US, do almost half of people not have access to this really basic thing that the rest of us take for granted? Well, there are several contributing factors. Of course, there's economics, right? Unemployment's, more than 8.5 times the national rate. Poverty is more than 3 times the national rate. Without any economic development, it's difficult to build infrastructure. Also, people, because they're so poor, can't come up with their own solutions to this problem. The easiest thing that they can do is walk out of their house to collect water, but most of that water has been contaminated by decades of Cold War era uranium mining. So we're left with this problem. And Dig Deep became the first global water organization in 2013 to take our focus and put it back here on the United States when we partnered with Darlene and her community to try to bring clean, running hot and cold water into people's homes. Water lines and wastewater lines were too expensive. but we knew our outcome was hot and cold running water. So we took some lessons that we had learned in the developing world and applied them here. We started investing in a series of water access points, like wells, that we could use to produce clean water for the system. And then we enlisted the help of Darlene and through community outreach some other school bus drivers to deliver that water to people's homes. And then in each home, like you saw in the intro video, we designed and installed home water systems. These 1,200-gallon underground tanks that keep the water safe and that use grid electricity or solar power to pump that water through a filter and a water heater into people's homes, into sinks, showers, and toilets. And so families, sort of go from this, from walking outside of their house to pick up water at a point however many miles away, to this. That's the same kid exactly 6 months later. And we continue to innovate around that model, developing solar prototypes, like again you saw in the intro video, for off-grid homes. Now we're actually working on remote sensing technology for the tanks so that we know how much water is in each tank at any given moment, and so we can use computer algorithms to plan the most efficient delivery routes for our trucks on a day-by-day basis. But there is still a lot more to be done. Right now with our project partners, we deliver clean water to 228 homes across 7 towns or chapters in rural New Mexico. It makes up almost a quarter of the population of the Navajo Nation now in geographic area. We have an all-local Navajo crew that install these home water systems. We can install about 2.5 a week. We're about 64 as of this week, working our way up to 228. And we have staff out every day collecting new survey information on potential clients in our area, working to train homeowners to operate and maintain their home water systems. And of course, we're doing constant outreach to new communities in New Mexico and Arizona who we think might be good candidates for this work. And so our work started on the Navajo Nation, but those 2 million Americans that I mentioned earlier, they live in nearly every state, from sort of the Northeast and the Appalachian corridor to the Deep South, to that big pocket in the American Southwest and down there along the border with Mexico in the Colonias. These communities are flint. These communities are Standing Rock. And it's kind of scary to say out loud, but this year we'll hand over our last African water project as an organization to our local partner, and we'll focus exclusively on the US. So we're the first to turn around and work here, and we'll be the first to commit to stay here and work on this problem, hopefully until it's solved. And there's a lot of excitement there, or else we wouldn't be doing it, but there's also a lot of fear, to be honest. I mean, there are a ton of questions that maybe some of you are thinking of right now about how difficult it might be to work here. These are all sort of super rural, last mile communities that are socioeconomically marginalized. How do you find them and build authentic connections with them that empower them to do something instead of just giving them a solution? How do you scale your solution? How do you scale as an organization as you're serving such diverse and geographically disparate areas? Well, one thing is for sure, the impact of our work is tangible, right? And really meaningful. You can drink and bathe in our impact. And this is what it looks like.
Yeah. Tolly? Oh my goodness!
I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. The good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. way of life can be free and beautiful.
Listen, thank you. It is a super weird and frustrating time in America. I assume that these seats are only half full because everyone's at home watching C-SPAN and Jeff Sessions. And sometimes like you get so caught up in that and you think to yourself like, well, what can I really do to make an impact in our own country? And if you ever get caught feeling that way, I have a water truck for you to ride. I promise it's less hot out in the desert than it is in this building. So turn off CNN, turn off Fox News, and pick up a shovel, because this problem is like really solvable. Americans have brought clean running water to millions of people in other parts of the world. We have the expertise, we have the technical resources, and I think literally the people in this building, by putting our heads together and working with communities, could solve this problem in our lifetimes. So thanks for having me.
Awesome, thank you so much, George. We'll open up for some Q&A now.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Anybody have a question?
I'm curious if you could share a little bit about how working with the indigenous community on the Navajo Nation has touched you and impacted you personally.
I'll speak about how it's impacted me personally and us as an organization. That sort of white guy syndrome from the development world like sort of didn't go away. You realize that these communities that you're touching in the US are marginalized socioeconomically and ethnically for a very specific reason, because they don't look like what mainstream Americans consider themselves to be or look like. And so there is a tremendous amount of cultural education and dialogue that has to go into this work. But fortunately, our approach is one that is focused on empowering communities instead of giving communities something or demanding something from them. So I think we went into the Navajo Nation with a very different attitude than a lot of organizations that have done that in the past. But we came across this reticence to work with us because people have such difficult memories from decades of colonial marginalization, but then of also broken promises and sort of empty solutions. So I think this project, for instance, took 2.5, almost 3 years just to develop the first iteration of. That's how long it took to go from person to person's house for every client, to get to know them, to build a base of community support that would gather on a regular basis quarterly and help us make decisions and help guide the project. And without those things, we knew it wouldn't work anyway, so we took the time to build that. It's also changed the face of us as an organization. When Dig Deep started, we looked a lot different than we do now. We're bigger, of course, but I'm the only white guy left on staff. And our donor base and our workforce base have changed dramatically. They've become more of color, more indigenous. And so we think a lot differently now as an organization because we're not as siloed in our sort of development world thought bubble that we used to be. Was that good enough? Does that answer your question?
Awesome. Anybody else have a question? All right.
I'm just wondering, with fracking gaining popularity, if you see your mission becoming even bigger and needing to be available in other communities as well as time goes on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our primary mission now is to expand water access and purification work into more communities on Navajo and then the first couple communities off Navajo. We're doing sort of project exploration implementation work in the border communities in Texas right now and in South Dakota. And those solutions will look very different from this one. But in the 5 to 10 year term, we'd really like to step into the space where we can be a first responder for water access emergencies that are going to happen more and more in the next few decades in places like Flint, where we're facing an over $1 trillion infrastructural gap in investment for water wastewater services. We continue to invest in things like airports and roads and bridges, things you can see, but most of our water and wastewater infrastructure is underground, where we haven't seen it since we built it over 100 years ago. I mean, cities like Boston and New York and some places are still relying on wooden pipes underground. And so we're going to see more and more of those infrastructural problems, and they're going to affect primarily the same marginalized low-income communities of color that we're already serving. And so we're trying to get there as an organization to be a first responder to those sort of crises as they become more common.
Hi, thank you. My name is Julie Crockford, and I am here in Boston. I head up an organization called ESC of New England. So my question is, in terms of bang for the buck, I'm suspecting that it costs a lot more to do your projects here
Oh yeah.
than it did when you were working in other parts of the world. And so from a fundraising perspective, has this opened doors because Americans want to think about America first, or, how's that playing for you?
There's a lot to unpack in that question, and so I'm going to hit it really fast. But short answer, our donor base has grown by over 800% since we started our first domestic water project. There's a tremendous amount of interest, and it cuts down both sides of the aisle. Every week I get a letter from someone being like, I wrote President Donald Trump to tell him this exists, and he'll solve it, and here's $50. And I get a letter from someone being like, I can't believe the federal government's not doing anything about this. Like, I'm a water warrior in my own local community, and I want to help. So I think there is a tremendous amount of support, and it sort of crosses the aisle. People support for their own reason. But we think about this problem all the time. It's more expensive, not just because the technology, the implementation is more expensive, but also the bureaucratic hurdles are more expensive. The amount of work you need to do to protect yourself from legal liability, for instance, is so much more expensive in the United States than it would be anywhere else. And that really does mean something for donor retention, for churn, for turnover. If you're investing in water access projects in South Sudan like we were, we could complete a water well that would give reliable access to 2,000 people in 3 months. And we could take your dollar, track it, and show you exactly how it impacted someone's life almost immediately. Here I take someone's dollar and I can't necessarily show them that same impact in a year, maybe 2 years. The projects are a lot more expensive. One of our home water systems costs $3,100 for one house, for instance. And that's a lot cheaper than laying a water line to that house that might cost $80,000, $100,000, $300,000. But it's still a big chunk to bite off for a donor. So the way we sort of deal with that is structurally, we have big community-based projects that take a lot of investment and a lot of time, and we balance those with quicker wins. $50,000 to $100,000 projects that serve one family or one school or one community center with things like purification or plumbing. And we do several of those a year to keep people engaged and interested and to really push the needle on how we're communicating about the issue too.
Okay, 2 more questions.
Hi, George. That was super inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks.
My name is Louisa Trackman, and I work with Creative Action Institute, and we work at the intersection of creativity and social change and environmental change. And
Me too.
Train local leaders to better engage with the communities. But my question is unrelated to that. Just thinking about how you're operating in these communities that should technically also be served by our government. How are you working together with government or not?
That's been a big question. So we are liaising with sort of tribal authorities and the federal government. One of the reasons this infrastructure doesn't exist yet is because there are so many overlapping jurisdictions that no one will take responsibility for actually solving the problem. So instead of, the traditional infrastructure development model in the US is, okay, wait, and infrastructure will catch up to you. But we're pretty confident that for these last 2 million Americans, infrastructure is not going to catch up to them. There's going to be no urbanization, there's going to be no economic development. And a lot of these populations can't or shouldn't have to leave where they already live. So we say, why not take a community development model like we'd use in the developing world and bring it here to give people access to water now. Access that we hope will someday be superseded by more industrial, regular access. So on the Navajo Nation, for instance, we partner with Indian Health Service and the U.S. Department of Agriculture Office of Rural Development. They have a map identifying where all the homes already are that don't have water access. And then we compare that to the tribal utility maps where they're building access. And we say, okay, what are those last mile communities that aren't going to get access in the next 5, 10, 20, or 50 years based on the utilities plan? And that's where we start and work our way in. So we do liaise with them, and we're hoping to work jointly on some projects in 2018 and beyond. But really, I think fundamentally, one of the wins in this kind of project is keeping as much bureaucracy as possible out and letting communities take the lead themselves because they know how best to serve their own needs. The idea that a school bus driver has enough time in between their 2 routes to deliver water to a system like this is the communities. They're like, oh, well, that's easy. We have people that already have CDLs that have half a day free. We have the facilities to maintain school buses and wash them. We can use those for water trucks. And that kind of community incentive, community insight and leadership is what we're trying to foster.
Last question.
Hi, I'm Melissa, and I work for Plant with Purpose, and we work with the rural poor internationally. And since you have experience working both internationally and nationally with that sector, I was curious if you have any similarities or striking differences that you've noticed.
This is going to be kind of a bummer answer to close on, but there are several real striking differences. I mean, the poverty looks very similar, right? In that the communities we're serving in sub-Saharan Africa or in the US, it's still predominantly women and girls waking up in the morning, grabbing a bucket, walking a couple miles to a water source they know will make them sick, and using it anyway, because it's the only thing they have. And the impact of that choice is the same in the US as it is in somewhere else. But the poverty here feels different because it's positional poverty. Most of our clients, for instance, go to a public school with other kids who showered this morning and who have a cell phone. And so that understanding of how poor you really are, that you don't have this basic thing that everyone else not only has but completely takes for granted, is so much more present. And so we see a lot of correlations in the areas we work between poverty and suicide rates, alcoholism rates, domestic abuse rates. You know, where you'd enter a community in a place like East Africa, and sometimes this is an unhelpful trope, but often it's true. You enter a place and there's a lot of joy and a lot of generosity and a lot of openness to trying new things. Sometimes you have to spend years overcoming just sadness, alcoholism, mistrust, and you have to be willing to really do that work and to be on the ground and be present to people for however long it takes. It's another thing that makes donor models complicated because, you know, it takes longer. But it's really important. You know, I think, God, I'm going to be such a development guy and like bust out a Mother Teresa quote. But like, I think Mother Teresa said there's a big difference between material and spiritual poverty, and that spiritual poverty is by far the more difficult thing to combat, but our bigger responsibility as humans. And I think that that's especially true for us as Americans, for people in our own country. We're the only people that can step into that space and be like, I'm here too, we're the same. And that doesn't mean we need to railroad all of our cultural, ethnic differences. It just means we need to provide them a reference point for compassion. And that's why I think a human rights-based approach is the right way to do this. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much, George. That was great. Up next, we have Kevin Kung. He's the co-founder of Takashar, which creates a network of waste management enterprises in Kenya that turn unmanaged agricultural residues into charcoal, a low-cost, non-toxic, and eco-friendly cooking fuel for low-income households. Kevin is a PhD researcher at MIT, specializing in biomass energy and combustion engineering. He has worked on low-cost engineering design and solutions in emerging markets such as Vietnam, Uganda, Ghana, and Kenya. He received his AB in physics from Princeton, a master in philosophy and physics from the University of Cambridge, and a master's in biological engineering from MIT. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Kevin Chung.
So hi everyone, thanks so much for the very generous introduction. My name is Kevin, and I'll be telling you something that may be a bit unsexy. It's fertilizer, and most of it actually is being produced in very large scale, capital intensive and very intensive facilities that are located in North America, China, and Europe. And what happens with the fertilizer is that it's then shipped via long distance to the remote areas, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, here in the Americas, or in the Indian subcontinent. So what happens is that because of this huge transportation markup, many rural farmers pay 2 to 3 times the world price for their fertilizer. So just take an example of Mr. Kibushi. He is a rural farmer in Kenya, and he has a small rice pot, and he spends a lot of his income on this fertilizer to the extent that he can only afford the cheapest synthetic varieties that over the long term actually degrades and acidifies the soil. And there are about 4 million people like him in Kenya who spends about $80 million a year on ineffective fertilizer. So what we do is that Takashar, we miniaturize and decentralize the fertilizer production process using technology. What happens is then we are able to support these low-cost, small-scale, and portable reactor units that can be deployed from farm to farm in rural areas, and therefore allow the on-site conversion of the local agricultural residues into a fertilizer blend that can be used locally. What this enables us to do is to set up these localized village-based fertilizer production that can then drastically cut down the long-distance transportation cost and produce something that's much more cost-effective, at the same time higher quality. Our product is Safi-Sarvi. You can look at it later. It's a carbon negative fertilizer blend that helps rural farmers improve their yields by up to 30%. So in addition to the yield improvement as well as the income improvement that the farmers can get, what this does is to support a network of these rural decentralized job and income opportunities. Additionally, in terms of environment, because this fertilizer uses a carbon-rich intermediate that stays inert in the soil for hundreds of years, it actually has a carbon sequestration effect, about 1.7 tons of CO2 per ton of the fertilizer. In addition to the waste management, as well as the averting the particulates and smog that's often associated with burning the otherwise unutilized agricultural residues. And how we are more effective and faster compared to the status quo is as follows. There are many of these large traditional fertilizer plants, such as OCP, Uralkali, and Yara, mostly, as I said before, located in North America, China, and Europe. And a lot of these cost hundreds of millions of dollars to set up, and they take many years before they can be commissioned. Our process takes only about $10,000 to set up and only 4 weeks. So therefore, we are both cheaper as well as much more agile. Compared to biological composting, it's 100 times faster in the sense that a lot of the composting right now that's being done today is excruciatingly slow, taking weeks if not months to finish the process, and our process, whereas, takes about 2 hours. Now, how this is going to work is that we set up these mini plants. So these are localized village-based fertilizer production plants that serve an area of about 10 miles. So imagine farmers that instead of burning their waste, now can use and operate the technology to turn it into a carbon-rich intermediate that can then go to the local mini plant that's then converted at a margin into the Safi-Sarvi and mixed with a proprietary recipe to make the nutrient complete. And once that's done, it can be sold back to the same community and via the local distributors, therefore completing this loop. So what we have done for the past 2 years is that we have set up about 150 of those reactors, primarily in Kenya in our pilot, and we've sold more than 130 tons of the product. And the farmers, after using our product, have the following to say.
Nilianza last season, nilipata zaidi ya kulikuwa hapo mbeleni. Na kwa sasa napata 30, 32, 33 hapo.
If they are not started using it, they should start now.
So this is Mr. Kibushi. He started using our process about 3 growing seasons ago. And over those past 1.5 years, he has seen his crop yield increase by about 40%. And that gave him enough income to send his 2 children to school, as well as afford a new tractor last growing season. And that's the sort of the social and environmental and economic impact that we are trying to make. For the next bit, I'm going to tell you more about whether this works in terms of economics, as well as how this can be scaled up. So right now we have proven that right now it takes about $140 per ton for us to produce the fertilizer using the locally available materials. And what we have also shown is that we can make a margin of between 35 to 60%. And given these figures, and with our current mini plant, what we can show is that each one of these village-based production can make a profit of about $21,000 a year. That may not seem like a lot for us, but for a village, that's about 40 or 50% of the current GDP of the whole village. And the return on investment in this case is about 1 year. And how we plan to approach this as an organization is as follows. Right now, we have open sourced the first version of our technology. It's published so that farmers, they can actually adopt it themselves without necessarily going through us. And it costs about $20 for them to set up these reactors. And we have seen already about 100, 200 of these being deployed. And the goal here is really to make it very widely available and to make those villages adopt the standard practice. And those who are interested in continuing to scale up the fertilizer production then can approach us for more high-performance reactors for recipes that can complete a nutrient, as well as a trademark and brand so that they can sell it as sabi-sarving in their communities. So the team behind this, my name is Kevin. I just graduated actually last week from MIT with a PhD, and thank you. I've been spending the past 6 years working on the core technology. And my business partner, Samuel Rigu, is based full-time in Kenya. He grew up in rural Kenya and witnessed firsthand the issues and challenges that his neighbors and families faced. And he grew up becoming agribusiness manager trying to solve this problem. Riley, who may have left here, but he is also based here with me, and he has expertise in financing and financials. And he has previously run a garden company in New England before. And we have also partners ranging from Orange, Tata, MIT, as well as Total. And right now we hire a team of 6 full-time and 2 part-time employees, as well as 15 casual workers, primarily in Kenya. In terms of our future vision, we are actually a for-profit company. Although we are not sort of a venture level growth kind of that expectation, what we do plan to do is to scale to millions of dollars in revenue in the next several years. And that will then enable us to really scale this up and really without much dependence on continuous donor injection to other countries and other parts of the world. So with that, I will end and take any questions. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, there we go. Anybody have a question?
My only question is, how can I invest in your company? This is awesome.
So the question is how...
How can I invest in your company?
Okay, let's talk afterwards.
Do you guys partner with organizations on the ground to implement your projects in different communities in Kenya or elsewhere, or do you guys take on the marketing and the sales and the community connections yourself?
Sure. Initially, with our pilot, we prefer to own and run everything ourselves because there are a lot of kinks to work out, and there's a lot of learning that needs to be, that's good for us to retain as well as we scale. And so initially with the first 3 to 5 pilots, these are what we have been and will be doing. At the same time, we have also been working with local community partners. These could be NGOs, these could be for-profits. I mean, we have seen both cases, and where they either work in the local farms and with the farmers, and their mission is to improve their lives, or they can be agricultural input-output producers. In that case, they provide the farmers with seeds and fertilizers, and they get the farmers crops. And for both cases, there's an incentive for them to work to make sure that the farmers get maximum yield. And in those cases, we have been able to implement projects in collaboration with them.
Anyone else?
Do you, considering how much waste we have in the U.S. around how conventionally, animals are dealt with here, and the need for carbon sequestration from a global perspective, do you have any thoughts about sort of expanding here, and then the opportunity for small farmers, which is really the heartbeat of kind of the local food movement, to gain access to your product?
Definitely. I think in the US there is definitely a niche, especially in rural villages, for these solutions to also apply. And there is increasing interest in having carbon negative or carbon neutral or organic farming, and all of these can be offered by our solution. Ironically, we started in Kenya because it's actually easier to start there. That's what we found actually, because for them, well, in this village, we didn't even need to go through any license, and it just took 2 weeks for us to set up the local production plant. And whereas if we needed to do in the US, it would take probably many, many months. But definitely that's something we are interested in doing. For us, we work in the service of remote communities, whether it's here or internationally.
Anybody else have a question for Kevin? Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. Okay, and last but certainly not least, we have Sam Tauscher. He's the co-founder of Coral Vita, where he works to counter global reef degradation through large-scale coral farming. He's been a passionate scuba diver since he was 13 years old. After graduating college, Sam helped launch a UN-funded coral farming project in partnership with the Mauritius Oceanography Institute and his organization ELI Africa. In working with these projects, he saw significant limitations to ocean-based farms, which led him to found Coral Vita with grad school classmate Gator, who's here in the front row. During this time, he also had the opportunity to craft climate adaptation policies at both the White House Council on Environmental Quality and the Global Island Partnership, helping to clarify the urgent need for action to save reefs. He received his bachelor's from Yale College and master's of environmental management from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He is a Wild Gift Fellow, a member of the Halcyon Incubator's 5th cohort, and was awarded the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute's Summer Fellowship. Please help me welcome to the stage Mr. Sam Tauscher.
All right, last one. How's everybody doing? It's hot, which I hope makes everyone think of the tropics, because that's where we're about to go. We're going to go down to the reefs and the oceans. So my name's Sam Tauscher. As mentioned, I'm the founder of Coral Vita, along with my friend Gator Halpern over here, and his name really is Gator. And we started Coral Vita, and we are growing corals to restore dying reefs. So looking now at how climate change and environmental degradation are impacting the planet, they're also creating a whole range of markets and opportunities that we never would have thought conceivable. We're now having to re-nourish beaches, pay for artificial snow, and engage in massive reforestation projects. So what we're thinking is, what's the next big market and what's the next big need in terms of environmental restoration? So many of us know that coral reefs are one of the most magical ecosystems on the planet. They're also one of the most important. They support over 1 billion people around the world and 25% of marine life, while also generating $30 billion a year through dive and snorkel tourism, fisheries at a commercial and an artisanal level, and through coastal protection, where they act as natural seawalls and reduce an average of 97% of wave energy before it hits the shore. To put that in perspective, looking forward, we're seeing a major shift in the way that insurance companies and coastal property owners view the value of reefs, as they are much more cost effective, in addition to just being much cooler and more important than traditional seawalls that we find out in most development projects. However, as many of you know, coral reefs are under serious threat. We've lost 30% of the world's reefs since the 1970s. We're projected to lose 75% of reefs by 2050, and over the past several years, we've heard terrifying reports coming out of the Great Barrier Reef, one of the most iconic places on the planet, where we lost over 2/3 of the northern Great Barrier Reef in a matter of years. There is some good news, though. We have found over the past several decades that coral farming, where fragments of corals are grown in nurseries and then transplanted back out into the wild, can help revive reef health and protect the ecosystem services that they provide. I myself helped start a ocean-based farm like the one you see here while I was living out in Mauritius, as was mentioned before, and to work with local fishermen and have them return to a lagoon that had previously been barren, setting up their traps 100 yards away, was pretty spectacular. But through that experience, I also got to see that there are some severe limitations with the current model. So, for example, only limited species of corals can be grown, like the branching species you see there. 6 to 9 months, they can be grown, but that leaves out a swath of the bigger, more massive encrusting bouldering corals. And got a couple samples here. No corals were harmed in the making of this presentation. But to get from this size to this size in nature could take 20 or 30 years versus 6 to 9 months. So traditionally, these projects leave out these types of corals, which are critically important. There's also little that can be done to enhance the resiliency of corals to warming and acidifying oceans that threaten their health. A storm could come along, a bleaching event, fisherman drops his anchor, the whole project is at risk. As well, the ocean-based farms pretty much have to be set up and maintained at each farm you want to restore, each reef you want to restore. And considering 75% of the world's reefs, 38 million square kilometers, give or take, that's not a scalable model. And then finally, as many of us here know, it can be very difficult to go out and get grants on a regular basis. And as awesome as it was to get that UN-funded grant to set up the coral farm in Mauritius, it was only so big, it lasted for so long, and then we had to fight to try and get another one. So this grant funding model, together with all the other features, isn't going to cut it when we think of the scope of this problem. That's why Coral Vita is using land-based farms, where we can accelerate coral growth, enhance the resiliency to climate change, put out a scalable model where we can supply an entire nation's reefs from a single site, while also creating a financially sustainable system, getting customers that depend on healthy reefs to pay for restoration. So walking through that a little bit more. With the land-based farms, we control the growing conditions. So one of our advisors is Dr. Ruth Gates out of the University of Hawaii. She's the president of the International Society of Reef Studies, so arguably the top dog in the coral science community. And she's at the forefront of a field she's dubbed assisted evolution. One of the things that we're looking into that Dr. Gates and others have proved out is that because we control these growing conditions, we can crank up the temperature, modify the acidity and pH to reflect future oceans, so that we can look forward decades in the future and train our corals so that when they're outplanted, they actually have a higher survival rate compared with the corals that are grown in natural methods. We can also run these corals through different tests and see which ones have just more natural heat tolerancy or acidity tolerancy, and there's a potential that we can help breed those corals together. And it's also worth mentioning that we're always using native corals. So when we're working in a particular country, we're using the corals that are found there, not bringing in any invasives. On that diversity side, and also the speed of growth, using the microfragmenting method developed by Dr. David Vaughn of the Moat Marine Lab, another one of our advisors, we can now grow corals up to 50 times faster. So remember the multi-decade difference we had here. From the size of those polyps you see on the side to that sort of dinner plate sized coral, that is 6 months old. It's using natural healing processes that are found in the corals themselves. And I'd be happy to go into the details of that later, but it was a pretty miraculous discovery and it completely changes the game for reef restoration. Then on the level of scale, so looking at an island nation or territory like the British Virgin Islands, if we were going to set up ocean-based farms, we'd have to set them up at pretty much every reef we want to restore. If big enough, we could have a single land-based Coral Vita farm supply all the restoration sites for an island or country from a single site. So right now, what we're looking at is launching our pilot coral farm, which I'm excited to say will be taking place in the Caribbean later this year, deciding on which country that's going to be in. This pilot will be a showcase for us to sort of serve as a proof of concept, build out the ecological and commercial efficacy of our model, build out some revenue streams, have it be an ecotourism attraction where people can participate in the process before we then scale up to do large-scale farms. Really accessible, we plan on integrating local communities into our projects. As we touched on before, it's essential to get the buy-in and stewardship of locals so they can serve as education centers. We want our farm managers to be trained reef scientists from that country, and we want to bring in local school children and university students where they can learn. Corals are grown in those tanks and then outplanted into the reefs. And as we've seen in restoration projects all around the world, as we have Gator giving us the good old okay, this was a previously barren lagoon, and that restoration project is looking pretty sweet. So in about 18 to 24 months, we plan on raising a new round, this time to do our first large-scale farm, where about an acre-sized facility can grow miles of coastline every 6 to 12-month growing cycle, and we can actually build out real revenue streams selling to the range of customers that depend on healthy reefs, including mitigation banks where you have to legally pay for corals that are damaged, hotels and resorts, private property owners, cruise lines, tourism operators, corporate sponsors, and governments. Everyone that depends or cares about those ecosystem service values that are so critical and also so threatened by reef degradation. So for our timeline, later this year, into hurricane season, which is the way we have to operate, we're planning on breaking ground on this first farm. Then in about 2 years or so, we plan on launching this first large-scale farm where we can really have ecosystem-level impact, and ultimately envision a global network of these farms working with the range of stakeholders and local communities to really create a viable model for reef restoration. little bit more about ourselves. You got my bio, so I won't go into that. Gator was working on international development projects in Peru, Brazil, and South Africa, and served as a fellow for the World Wildlife Fund's Global Marine Program. We've got two of the best coral scientists in the world serving as our advisors, Dr. Vaughn, who's also our inspiration for beard growth. He's the one that developed the accelerated coral farming methods, and Dr. Gates, who has pioneered this resiliency field in terms of coral restoration. And then a range of business advisors who have co-founded a suite of different venture-backed companies that are providing us with some great financial, technical expertise and a great network as well. We've raised just over $750,000 so far. We need 600,000, so we're on our way. We're now going for $1 million, and that will let us do more educational programming, run some research and development projects to develop our own IP, and just increase our impact in general. A lot of awesome traction, really excited to be here at Classy. Also very excited to announce that last week, Gator and I were named Equine Green Fellows. So that's a really awesome community to be joining up as we really try to work with people around the world to make this happen. And on that front, we are facing a problem that affects all of us, even if you live in the middle of the country and have never gone snorkeling or scuba diving in your life. But through a collaborative effort, and hopefully with everyone coming down to plant corals with us, people will come help bring reefs back to life. And we look forward to having you on this journey. Thank you very much.
Great stuff. Who has some questions? Everybody understood that process, huh?
Super easy, awesome.
From the time that you take the coral from the farm then to the reef, what's the integration process like, or how long does it take for growth?
It depends on the species. Generally 6 to 12 months. So if we had a farm up and running tomorrow, we would go out, identify which corals are healthy and need of transplantation, right? We wouldn't want to take diseased corals. Bring them to our farm, take them through that whole enhanced resiliency and accelerated growth process while identifying where the right locations for restoration can be. Not every reef can be restored. We once had a hotel, saw it as a business venture. They were like, sweet, we're gonna have our guests come plant corals. Next to their beach was a river, and upstream was a textile factory. So until that shuts down, that reef's not being restored. So we'll make sure we identify the right sites in that sort of growth period, which can be on average that sort of half year to a year.
How do you keep the new coral from bleaching from the rising ocean temperatures?
So with these, both the control over those growing conditions is the easiest way to explain it. We would go collect the corals from out in the sea and bring them to the farm. Then looking at scientific models and projections for warming temperatures, we can actually modify the temperatures in our tanks. And corals as animals, they actually have memories. And so we would sort of stress them in gradual increments so that they develop a tolerance and a memory for those altered temperatures. And our advisors have been doing this in Florida, Hawaii, elsewhere around the world. And this past sort of El Nino bleaching event that took out swaths of the Great Barrier Reef, the significantly higher survival rates, over 80, sometimes 90% survival rates compared to the corals that were either out there or grown in the more sort of traditional farms. So it's really important. People often ask us, well, you're gonna put these corals back out into the ocean. Isn't that a sort of redundant process? And we know that we can now take steps to boost that resiliency, which is critical.
Great job, by the way. But
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit more about your funding model? You said the folks who will benefit from the wreaths are the ones who pay for them. I can't remember exactly what you said.
Do you want the investors or the customers?
The customers.
Yeah, so we're starting in the ecotourism space. So we're looking at how if you are a hotel owner and I am a dive tourist, I'm not going to spend a lot of money to go to your location if the reef is dead. So in addition to not only providing restoration for you as a hotel, we also can create a whole new ecotourism attraction. So the farms, because they're on land, very accessible, and people might want to go play golf or go horseback riding, or they could come visit our farm, pay for that sort of experience, snorkel out over our restoration site, and then even come out and plant corals with our team, or sponsor corals for their loved ones, or get a Reef Restoration dive certification, which is something that the dive agencies are now offering. So we would start in that ecotourism space, and then we're looking at property developers, where it's pretty cool to have beautiful fish and colors off your property, but if the engineering is sound enough, there's now some reinsurance industries and companies that are looking at how someone who pays for that service could then have their insurance premiums lowered because it protects the coastline. If you're a government who might have access to these big international funding streams for climate adaptation, you're worried about the food security and economic consequences of reef degradation. So there's a lot of new interesting conservation financing mechanisms that are coming online to pay for those things. So that's sort of the way we see they stand to lose out if the reefs are dead, and the grant model isn't going to cut it for the scope of the problem. Yeah.
My very crude understanding of a coral reef is that it's a ecosystem where there are many different species, and that forms a symbiotic relationship with the coral reefs. So I'm curious for your accelerated growth process, how does that address this entire ecosystem beyond the coral reefs?
So how do we address like the diversity? Is that what you? The speaker was back there. I couldn't really hear.
Right. For example, how would you be able to replicate that system before you transplant the corals back?
Right. So we would do like a baseline survey and assess what's actually out there and what's important. And now with this accelerated growth method, the microfragmenting, we can now look at the whole swath of corals that we are able to grow. Before it was very limited. You miss out on a lot of that. So it doesn't just improve the cost effectiveness and the speed, but also touches on that ability to grow more corals that are found in that ecosystem so that we can really try and replenish what counts and what matters.
Hey, how established are you in Hawaii?
How established are we in Hawaii? We're not. I will give a plug. There are some awesome coral farmers in Hawaii, and we're not trying to do this on our own. There's amazing people in the reef restoration community, community-based projects in the Philippines, institutes and the government actually in Hawaii, nonprofits in the Caribbean. So it's a global effort. The University of Hawaii, though, is where one of our advisors, Ruth Gates, works. So they're doing stuff, and then also the Department of Aquatic Resources has got a program there that's also doing restoration work.
I work for an ecotourism company that is cutting edge. They have a patented new boating design. And the owner was actually talking to me because I'm part of branding for ocean awareness, and we're trying to bring in the community education and everything with this new venture. And he just like blue skied, was like, we want to link up with somebody who's regrowing the coral reef. So I'd love to speak with you.
Yeah, we want to do this all around the world.
Yeah.
So cool. And if there's no other questions, anyone else? One more.
One more.
I think we all want some water and air.
Hey, thanks. So you touched on this a couple of times, but I know the money is in sort of ecotourism and that space, but reefs are also really important for food security, as you said, and for indigenous communities, for marginalized communities. And you talked a little bit about working with governments maybe to work on that problem, but I'm just wondering if you could speak to that more, of just how you're going to actually provide it for customers who can't pay for it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an issue of the commons. We're not like pretending that it doesn't exist. And we're looking at how the big fisheries associations could be customers, but there's a couple different ways we're looking at that. One is for the impacts that we sort of measure. Obviously, the number of corals that are planted and survivorship and growth, but we also want to look at, compared to degraded reef, what's the changes in fish stock population and abundance and diversity? How was the wave energy reduced? There's a range of different things. So on that front, we definitely want to work with those communities. So we've thought about how local fishermen could be retrained to be part of our dive team, have an alternative job source that hopefully, we'll see, in turn could also reduce the need to fish as much, which could then in turn boost fish stocks, but also promote that local stewardship. And then also just by planting the corals, the fish often come. So they should be able to benefit from that just by association. But we would want to work with those communities, and then in tandem with the government, who hopefully would then, either through donors, Island Nation government resources are a thing to manage, but looking at those sort of funders who care about these issues, Bloomberg has got a whole big thing with fisheries. Rockefeller. There's a whole bunch of different folks who are looking at this issue. And I just was talking to someone from the Marine Stewardship Council about how we could tap into this. So it's definitely something that we're very cognizant of and want to try and help out with. So.
I have a quick question for you. Sorry if I missed this, my timer's pretty demanding, so if you already mentioned this, I'm sorry. But
bring it.
When you were mentioning like kind of manipulating the environment so you could kind of plan for future threats to coral, do you see the future threats kind of being more of the same of what's contributing to that degradation now, or are there newer, kind of more unforeseen threats that you see in the future?
Depends on where we're working. We initially want to start in the Florida Keys. Florida Keys, 95 to 98% of the reefs are already dead. 80% of the Caribbean reefs are dead. That wasn't usually because of climate change. I mean, to be perfectly frank, that was one of the big factors was that they had a septic system in the Keys. Everything washed out. There's disease outbreaks, sedimentation, overfishing. We don't think about this often, but if you like catch too much of the fish, like parrotfish, then they're not cutting down on the algae, so when corals die, the algae takes over and the corals have nowhere to settle and recruit. So overfishing actually causes degradation as well. So that's why we want to work in areas where they are not only are we building in for those sort of climate changed oceans, but they're putting into place marine protected areas. They're reducing those sort of impacts that have already been degrading reefs so that in tandem we can really have an impact. Because like I said before, we're not going to pretend that every reef can be restored. But restoration works, and if it's done the right way with the right people, it really can make a difference, and that's what we want to be working on. And I'll wrap up by just saying again, seriously, come find us in Plant Corals. We would love to have you to come down. It's a lot of fun.
Big round of applause for Sam.